Hello and welcome to the MSTieCast. I'm Josh MacLeod, and today it is just me and writer of the Cosmic Galaxy of Mystery Science Theater 3000, 12 classic episodes in the Movies They Lampoon, Mr. Chris Morgan. Thank you for being here, Chris.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah. Well, welcome to the show. I know it's sort of intimate today. Usually we have more people, but we were kind of short notice, but that's okay. And you're also a pop culture writer as well.
Yep.
Okay. Well, let's start the way we always start, which is, how did you first get into, discover Mystery Science Theater 3000?
Let's see. It was, the show was on the Sci-Fi Channel, so it was, in the last few seasons. I think perhaps I was just watching TV with my, family, because I was, still a young lad at the time, so sometimes we'd be watching TV with my parents and siblings or what have you, and I think just happened to flip the station over to the Sci-Fi Channel. This was when they were still showing some episodes at night in sort of a quasi prime time place. I'm fairly certain, because I don't think I first saw it on Saturday afternoons or Sunday afternoons, whatever it was, or mornings really. That's why I watched it primarily, would be when they started showing the show, mostly on weekend mornings. But I think just the show was put on. I couldn't tell you the exact episode, but it just became something that we watched, and I became a huge fan of the show. And like I said, I would watch it on in the mornings, and they'd also show it really late at night. I remember staying up super late at night to watch Final Justice, the Joe Don Baker classic. And so, yeah, I mean, it was, at the time, not exactly the easiest show to watch. And I didn't, of course, know, the history of the show or anything like that. When I first saw the Mystery Science Theater 3000 movie, and I saw, Dr. Clayton Forrester for the first time, I had, no idea who it was. I didn't, I only knew Pearl as the villain, so I thought it was some sort of brand new villain, because this was, the internet was still in its nascent days. I do remember going to the Sci-Fi Channel website to go to a Mystery Science Theater 3000 portion of that site, which had some sort of caption game thing you could do, where they take a still of the movie and you could put a caption on it or something. But anyway, so yeah, during the end of the show's run, I started watching it on Sci-Fi Channel, and of course after the fact went back and started watching Joel episodes and etc. Got to a point where I could plausibly write a book about the show and know what I was talking about.
Do you remember when you decided to start writing the book?
I wrote the book a little, I don't even remember the exact date, but I wanted to write a book, and then I started trying to think of things I could write a book about, a nonfiction pop culture book, because that's sort of the thing I do. I wanted to do that, and at first, I think the first thing I may have been thinking of was a Simpsons book, because I'm also a huge Simpsons fan, but that's a market that's been saturated. And so I was like, well, Mystery Science Theater 3000, that's another thing I love. I could definitely write a book about that. And at first I was going to write, a book that'd be more a series of essays about the show, until I hooked onto the idea of what became the book, where I, write about, 12 episodes, like it says in the title of the book, plus also the shorts and the movie, and so I realized I could tell the sort of history of the show and sort of do TV criticism about the show while also talking about the movies, because the book is half about Mystery Science Theater 3000, it's also half about the particular movies I chose, and it's a work of TV criticism and film criticism sort of wrapped together. And so I got that idea, and I pitched it pretty much as soon as I had it, and then, it was, the publisher was into the idea pretty much right away, so it was a fast process, at least getting started, and then I had to actually, write the book, which was, a little bit longer of a process, but not that bad, because, I was reading about Mystery Science Theater 3000, so it was, a pleasant experience.
How many times did you watch each of the 12? Or did you just watch it once? For the sake of writing the book.
For the sake of writing the book, I watched them all just once right before starting the chapter. Because most of the episodes I'd already seen several times, so it wasn't but I wanted to make sure it was fresh in my mind. So I was able to, I'd watch before I started every given chapter. I'd watch the movie immediately beforehand, and then of course sometimes I'd have to go back to watch a little clips or scenes from the movie if I need to have specific details down. But I'd watch it one time in its entirety right before I began every chapter.
And how did you decide which 12 you would use?
It was a mixture of reasons. I wanted to get sort of different kinds of episodes, so I included some classic things and classic episodes with a Space Mutiny, and obviously I want to include the first episode from the the Comedy Essentials / Comedy Channel days, Crawling Eye, and I put, for example, I put Kitten with a Whip in there because it's sort of a different kind of episode. So it wasn't all sci-fi stuff and monster stuff. And then I wanted to put important episodes in there, which is why Soul Taker's in there, which is why Laser Blast is in there, and Mitchell's in there. And so it was a mixture of reasons. Basically, episodes that I thought would give me different stuff to talk about, but also touched on key parts of Mystery Science Theater 3000 history.
Why specifically Kitten with a Whip from season 6? That's the big outlier in my mind.
Well, I wanted to write about the teen angst films because Mystery Science Theater 3000 had a few of them,
Violent Years.
Yeah, stuff a couple Ed Wood films, yeah, and then so I want to do those, and Kitten with a Whip is, I think, it's probably my favorite episode of the teen angst ones, and it's got, it's interesting because it's got, Anne Margaret and John Forsythe in it, so it's not a super, rink-a-dink movie, it's not like an Ed Wood movie. It's got, Anne Margaret was, a big star, and who eventually was nominated for, Academy Awards, and she was, at the time, I think she'd probably already been in Bye Bye Birdie and maybe in Viva Las Vegas, but she was, a big ingenue of, the era, and John Forsythe, who was on Charlie's Angels, so it's, that made it kind of interesting to me and gave it sort of a hook for me to talk about, and I just think it's a really good episode. And it's also more of a competently made movie than most Mystery Science Theater 3000 movies. I sort of, to be able to touch on that as well, that it's a competently, but, still not a good movie, but a competently made movie, which is, a different change of pace from, say, Manos, The Hands of Fate, or what have you.
Was there anything you discovered over the course of writing the book that you didn't know before?
Well, there's some stuff about the history of the show, in particular, in the early days of getting it on the ground and getting onto, the Comedy Channel, or also sort of the logistics of the movie and the decision to make the movie a road show, an old school road show and stuff like that. That's sort of bits of history and what have you about the show that I did not necessarily have information about, but in terms of watching the show and in terms of the show itself, I don't think there's anything that I found to be particularly new or notable. It's interesting to always watch the evolution of anything, and watching it throughout the years, and you can definitely see the show sort of evolve and change, and see and even to the extent there is characterization within the show that the Tom and Crow in the Joel years are different than Tom and Crow in the Mike years, and so it's and not just because the voice of Tom Servo changed after the first season, or the voice of Crow changed with the show at the Sci-Fi Channel, but it's sort of characterizations would be tweaked, and obviously as the show went on, in terms of the kind of material they would use for the riffing and sort of the quality of the riffing, also of course the frequency of the riffing, because if you go back to watch the very early episodes of the show, and for the book even, I watched one of the KTMA episodes, and to watch something like that and then compare it, obviously that's a very different sort of thing. That was local television or what have you, but it's interesting sort of so to see it all laid out in front of you and to sort of do it mostly chronologically, which the book was written mostly sort of chronologically, it is sort of interesting to watch the show evolve. It's not anything that'd be surprising to anybody else who sort of did the same thing, but not necessarily a lot of people who have been in a condensed period of time watching one episode from every season. to get through the entire course of the show. But definitely you can watch sort of the show ebb and flow and evolve over the years, and it's an interesting thing to see as somebody who's got an affinity for pop culture and for the show specifically.
And they made, I mean, the obvious thing is the amount of references. Do you think that helped inspire your pop culture love, or do you think that because this is basically a chicken or the egg question, were you a pop culture fan before Mystery Science Theater, or did Mystery Science Theater make you one?
I've been hugely into pop culture, like even since I was like a little kid, and I mean, fortunately, I did not have the kind of parents who were against watching television. So I mean, I've been watching a ton of television for like my entire life. And when I was a little kid, like when I was like 6 years old, I would stay up like late into the night watching Nick at Night. Like I remember watching like shows like Bob Newhart Show, Mary Tyler Moore Show, which obviously go way over my head. Like when I was 6 years old, before like The Simpsons became my favorite show, like 7 or 8, my favorite show was Dragnet, which was a cop show from the 60s, which is a bizarre show to be anybody's favorite show, let alone a small child, because Dragnet is basically a show creator and star Jack Webb lecturing hippies for a half hour.
Yeah.
So I mean, I've always been really into pop culture, and so I think that's part of what made Mr. Science Theater 3000 click with me even at a young age. It's really as I got older and was able to understand more of the references within it. But it's partially it's just people making funny jokes over a bad movie that before I could truly sort of appreciate the reference humor to the necessitated degree. So it's not all about the references, but in short, yeah, I've always been really sort of a big consumer of pop culture, which definitely made something like Mystery Science Theater 3000 more in my wheelhouse than if I were not sort of inclined to that already.
It's interesting watching episodes when you don't understand the pop culture reference, and then you understand the pop culture reference later, because you gain kind of a whole new appreciation for the joke, as small as it may be.
Yeah.
Do you remember how old you were when you first saw it?
Because the show, if I remember correctly, ran on Sci-Fi Channel from 97 to 99. So, I mean, and I watched the show before the movie came out, so I'm going to guess I was probably 11 years old when I first saw the show. It's definitely roughly around that time when I would have first seen the show.
Do you think, because it's about me as well, about 12, 13, and I think that's a pivotal point in a lot of fans of Mystery Science is seeing it around that age. I don't know if you would agree. It's interesting watching the progression, because early episodes, they obviously don't have the amount of riffs down. They're still trying to figure it out. Was it ever hard to sit through something like Gamera or a Crawling Eye, or when I mean Gamera, I mean the KTMA Gamera? Was it ever hard to sit through those for you?
The KTMA Gamera is rough because that episode is only Joel, because Trace and Josh were unable to be there when they had to tape that episode, and it's the logistics of making TV on that sort of scale and budget. So it's literally just Joel in the theater by himself, and he riffs maybe once every minute or so. So it's mostly just watching Gamera. And fortunately, Gamera is one of the, better movies. Like, I mean, it's adequate but kind of cheesy kaiju film. So it's not, like, if it was like a worse movie, that'd be pretty, but I mean, it's like, at a certain point, it's like you're just watching Gamera, basically, at that level. Crawling Eye is actually a fairly fine episode.
I agree.
There are some other rough runs from the first couple seasons that I don't enjoy as much as like later episodes, where riffs get kind of repetitive and so on and so forth. So, but like that episode happens to be fortunately a good one, and the KTMA stuff, I mean, but it's not, that's sort of to be expected, but yeah, like, and that's sort of why it's good they went back to do, the Gameras again when they had sort of money and resources, because that first time around is just, watching one man making comments to himself about a movie, and that's, barely even Mystery Science Theater 3000 at that point.
It just becomes the scene in Omega Man.
Yeah.
Charlton Heston, which was an inspiration. But the reason I bring that up is because we were just watching Robot versus the Aztec Mummy not long ago, maybe 2 months ago. I can't speak for my colleagues, even though I know they didn't like it either, but I was just screaming, like, when is this movie going to end? Because it's a tough slog.
That's one of the ones that came to mind, actually, when I was thinking of episodes from the early seasons that are kind of... that and what's First Spaceship to Venus, is that one that movie's called? It's something along those lines. That one's kind of... I remember in particular, that's like the riffs get pretty repetitive in that episode as well, you know. They just, you know, because they were in the early seasons, is a little less written, and particularly in the first season, a little more sort of improvisational, and so you hit on the same joke a few times, and you don't necessarily even realize it because you're just, you know, riffing, and you know, so it's like you're not keeping tally of what you've already said in your mind, and then it just becomes a case where, like, you know, Tom's sort of listening to the same thing like 4 or 5 times in the course of an episode, and it's like, you know, it's not what people think of when they think of Mystery Science Theater 3000. It's, you know, a crude version of that.
Yeah, and I think the movie plays a heavy factor in that, having the right film to do. And in your book, you said that each film is an artistic vision. What do you think makes for a good Mystery Science Theater movie?
Well, it needs to be bad, but in a way that is interesting. Because I was thinking, like, there's like a few, like, cause often I think about like the worst movies ever to be on that on the show, and I think I even wrote an article to that effect for Paste Magazine one time about the worst movies to be on the show. But like there's some, like The Castle of Fu Manchu, which is a slog of a movie. That movie is so just convoluted and dull, and it doesn't lend itself at all, because it doesn't bring anything to the table. Because it's just a bad movie that actually sort of brings you down. Whereas a movie like Hobgoblins is amazingly bad, but in a really sort of delightful and entertaining way. That really sort of like it's because Hobgoblins is the kind of movie that it's like you would watch ironically with people, or like to go to a movie theater to watch a movie with people to laugh at it, because it's really bonkers and out there, and the acting's really bad, but in like a funny way. And the movie's got so many insane ideas, and it's so its ambition is greater than anything that, you know, Rick Sloan and the cast could possibly achieve, and that makes it it's fascinating in how bad it is, and it's entertaining in how bad it is. Whereas a movie that's, you know, competently dull, or, you know, does not have ambition, can be, you know, it doesn't really work, because the movie doesn't. I mean, there's movies that don't really bring anything to the table, but they don't take anything away either, which is like a Gamera. It's like, you know, it's like fine, like it's not like if you watched, like, it's basically, if a movie could be entertaining, if you're watching it without Mystery Science 3000, it's sort of perfect for the show, because they get to enhance something that's already, you know, worthwhile, as opposed to having to shoulder the entire load and the entire burden of being entertaining, while sort of, you know, having to counterpunch against the movie that's actively sort of dismal in its execution.
I just looked at the list real quick, and first of all, how dare you not put Robot versus the Aztec Mummy on that list? Because we just had a long-standing discussion about what the worst movie they ever did was. So
I think since I'm gonna have to look at that up, because sometimes, you know, like, it's the sort of list where it's always with any sort of list, it's at that moment what your you know, what are the worst movies or whatever. So I'm gonna, because there's one that I've seen. I think that I watched it like again after I had after I wrote the list, and I'm instead of continually vamping just in case. I think maybe the worst movie they've actually ever had on there is The Brain That Wouldn't Die, actually, which is, you know, Mike's first. There we go. I found the article, because that movie is really poorly made. It's a real sort of like slog of a movie, and it's also like a really sort of ugly, like movie. It's really hideous and like mean-spirited and grotesque, and like everybody's so awful, and it's a really skeezy, scuzzy movie that's also just really poorly made. And so that's, it's not even, it's actively like unfun as opposed to being like, so I mean, obviously something like Manos or what have you.
Yeah, and these taste things are always subjective, because a lot of the ones that I see on these lists, I'm like, really? Was that really that bad? The one I always think is Final Sacrifice tends to come up a lot on these lists. And I never agree with that, just because it's kind of, I mean, it's a pretty good movie for what it is, which is a student film, basically.
Yeah, I mean, that one's entertaining in its own way. I think that's just because that one's, I think it becomes a matter of iconic, it's like an iconic episode of MST3K because of Rosdower, and the way if you put it on a list, everybody remembers the Rosdower episode. And it's not a good movie. It's a poorly made movie, but it's because it's so memorable, and for various reasons, it becomes a thing. It's easy to put that on there because it's become a thing.
Taste and hatred of things are subjective, because obviously there's episodes that I'm guessing your top 5 favorite episodes are not going to be exactly the same as my top 5 episodes, are not going to be the same as some other guy's top 5, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah, definitely.
Because there's a few episodes in there that always get. Are there any episodes that people tend to speak highly of that you don't care for?
Let me think about that. That's an interesting question. I'm trying to think of episodes that are sort of classic, in that I guess I'm sort of plugged into what's like considered like the most popular episodes or what have you. But I guess maybe like I feel like Egon's maybe kind of considered a classic episode because of Watch Out for Snakes, which is a classic sort of moment. And that episode's like it's good, but like I don't consider it like a great episode of the show.
I would argue there you go. Subjective. I would argue it is a classic.
Yeah, I mean it's fine, but like it's not like it's not anything special. And I mean the Coleman Francis movie episodes, I don't necessarily think of as being particularly good episodes either. I mean they're good episodes. Like there's very few Mr. Censorship episodes where I wouldn't say like aren't good, but like I mean I don't know if those are necessarily considered classic or just remembered as being like really bad movies, which obviously they are really bad movies. But they're also like not like super like great episodes, at least as I sort of remember them off the top of my head. I don't know, maybe I'm not sure if Parts the Clonus Horror is considered a classic episode or not, or just another one that I feel like sort of is. I remember, but that's
I think that one's. It's people like it. I don't know if it's a classic in line with something like Spider Invasion or something.
Yeah.
I don't know. I like it, but
it's these are like good episodes, but they aren't like episodes I think are great, but necessarily other people think are great either. I just I'm just looking through the list and trying to think. Because like one of my least favorite episodes that maybe considered good is like is Squirm. That's only because Squirm's a really gross movie.
Yeah. Well, and I do know people that have limits, and again, I think I don't know if you would agree with this or not, but the taste of the film, whether you can stand the film, affects whether you like the episode.
Oh yeah, definitely to a degree, because like Squirm was like one I had to sort of just be like, well, I want to hear the jokes and stuff in the episode, so I'm gonna have to sit through it. But like it's a really gross movie with a ton of worms in it, so it's like it's unpleasant in that way. It's like viscerally sort of gross, and it's not like the movie's gross, like say like some of Ed Wood's movies are like gross or what have you. But it's like viscerally like a unpleasant like bunch of worms all over the place sort of movie. But like it also has Case of Spring Fever as like the short on it, which is of course a classic short. But it's definitely like if a movie is something that's and I mean obviously. MST3K 3000, these movies were edited for content for television, which changes things. Particularly and memorably in the case of Side Hackers, which was a movie that sort of changed the way they handled selecting movies and making sure they watched a movie entirely through before putting them on, selecting them for the show. But so it's usually you're not gonna get like brutal violence or anything, generally speaking, on MST3K 3000. But occasionally there is gross, weird-looking monster things or whatever. But yeah, and if you're not into sort of that sort of stuff, or that sort of stuff is not to your taste, then having a silhouette of a man and a couple robots cracking wise on the screen isn't going to make it a pleasurable viewing experience. If you're fighting against that much sort of going into it.
Incredible Melting Man is the other one people point to in that category of unbelievably gory. And because of that, hard to watch. I don't know if you'd agree with that or not. So, going through each of the 12, I know we have the book and stuff, we can read it, but did you gain a respect for any of the 12 movies going through it? Crawling Eye, Catalina Caper, etc.
Well, there's gaining... Crawling Eye, while not a good movie... is certainly because it's like like the first episode or what have you of like but it's not actually that bad of a movie all told. It's kind of okay sort of monster movie. It's obviously it's not good and the monsters are kind of silly, but it's obviously an old movie, so that sort of thing happens. But I mean, a lot of the movies I chose were movies that are like really sort of like bad movies, and The Kid with the Whip I already knew was sort of like adequate, and I mean obviously like a movie like Pod People or like Manos is a truly like train wreck sort of movie, and and like Kelly and Caper is like from a genre movie I actually do really enjoy. Like I like old beach party movies. Like I like sort of like the ones that API made with like Frankie Avalon and Annette Funicello. So it's something that is sort of up my alley, but that's like not a good version of that. Like it's one of the rare comedies they tried to sort of handle, and they because that's sort of like a trickier thing to do. But it's that movie's like. It's definitely not good, but obviously it's competently made. It had notable famous people in it, like Little Richards, and it's basically like a beach party movie. Only it's not made by like the same people who made the other sort of like beach party movies. So it's that's a movie that's competently made, but it is sort of really not good and not like because even like like Beach Blanket Bingo or Muscle Beach Party aren't like they're sort of campy good, but like there's qualities of them that are generally good, and also qualities of them that are generally sort of like fail in sort of filmmaking. Like there's always cringing sort of like comedy in those, not like cringe comedy like The Office, but like it's such a bad sort of cheesy thing that's happening that's cringy. But so Catalina Caper is not necessarily but if like I would encourage people to check out the beach movies that were made with Frankie and Annette, as opposed to checking out Catalina Caper, which is a very poor version of those films, which is why it ended up on MSTieCast 3000. While although eventually those beach party movies devolved into things like The Ghost in the Invisible Bikini and Dr. Goldfoot and the Bikini Machine, but that's that's down the ways a bit. And those movies could have definitely ended up on MSTieCast 3000, but I assume they're probably just too expensive.
Well, and a lot of those beach movies, really, the plot is the plot is irrelevant 90% of the time with those movies. I don't think I'm speaking out of that. It's the kids go down to the beach, they have a frolicking good time. The adult or the figure of authority wants to stop them. The kids, fight against it and eventually either ward off the adult or convert the adult to their way of thinking. The end.
Yeah, and like in the Frankie and Annette ones, Frankie and Annette are always like, together, then they're not together, then together again at the end, and there's, cameos from like, famous people, and there's always usually like a fight scene. So yeah, it's very formulaic, and it's mostly about like the music and like the people dancing and stuff like that with very limited bit of plot. But yeah, I mean there's so there's quality and charm, and they also I really like these sort of aesthetics of that sort of film, sort of like the bright 50s 60s sort of poppy aesthetic. But yeah, the movies are very plot is definitely
Shallow.
secondary if not tertiary. Yeah, it's it's not about the plot, but they still have their charms, which Kelly Camper doesn't, and also has a lot of sort of slapstick humor that completely falls flat every single time.
Mm-hmm. You have early. I mean, that's the thing. They did 2 Tommy Kirk movies. Neither of them I thought were really all that great. They were both comedies. That and Village of the Giants.
Mm-hmm. Village of the Giants is I mean that's I don't know. That one's maybe
it's weird because it's combining. It's 2 facets of it. You have Bird Eye Gordon, who they did about a bunch of Bird Eye Gordon films, and this movie is nothing like any of his other movies in that it's a comedy.
Yeah, and it's very much got a sort of that style of like those of comedy too, in terms of like because it's not like it's where like there's science things make crazy things happen, and like there's like it's teenagers, and like then they become the giants, and they're like mean, and then they're not giants anymore, and so it's a little I guess sort of like 60s sexuality sort of stuff in there too. It's sort of like a campy, quasi sexy sort of thing they got going on there. It is a mishmash of things. And, it's the sort of thing that when done well is, good, campy fun, but that one's, it's kind of dull, even if I believe it's Beau Bridges is in it.
Yep. He plays the lead. He plays the lead bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, and they didn't do too many movies that I think fall into the category of intentional camp. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think of any other ones they would have done.
There's Wild Woman of World of Batwoman, which is one of my favorite episodes because that movie is completely insane and such a failure of filmmaking, but it's really funny in how bad it is. Like it's the rare sort of movie that's going for camp and becomes camp, but not in the way they intended, which is fascinating. And that movie is just so bad, but in a wonderful way that it helps make it a great episode, combined with, of course, the Mystery Science Theater 3000 treatment and the fact that they had so much to work with, because that movie gives you so much to riff on in all its insanity.
I guess the other one would be Diabolic.
Yeah, and that's interesting that's because I read an article once online I believe on the AV Club where that movie was being just straight up recommended as a movie by a film critic because it's not like a lot of other Mystery Science Theater 3000 movies, and it certainly is of a better quality, and it is sort of just like going for a certain thing, and it has it's a very sort of like stylish Italian sort of like camp heist film, and yeah, that's so it's so strange to me always that ended up just being like the last episode, because it's so unlike when people think of Mystery Science Theater 3000, they don't think of movies like Danger Diabolique. They, it's not like a monster movie or an aliens movie or even like sort of like a ghost movie, and it feels, well, it's it's a fine episode and I enjoy the episode, and so it's like a good episode. It's just like it's almost a shame, but not necessarily truly a shame that was the last episode or the movie for the last episode. But it would have, felt more fitting if it had been a more, quote, Mystery Science Theater 3000 kind of movie.
I'm trying to think of what would have exclusive to season 10. I'm trying to think of something that would have been good. You're not going to pick Hamlet. You're not going to pick It Conquered. I
would say probably Horrors of Spider Island.
Yeah, which is one. But the problem with that one is most people don't like that episode. Most people would say they wouldn't want to end on that note because a lot of people don't like. I love Horrors of Spider Island, but most people think of that as probably the lowest in season 10 aside from Hamlet.
Yeah. Well, then I would maybe say Future War would probably, and because that'd also be interesting because it's sort of one of the more recent movies that they ever made, and it's got a lot of crazy stuff, and it's got future stuff and aliens, and I feel like people like that episode. I certainly like that episode.
I do. Yep. I don't know if it, but made mistakes, but I think when most people think of movies that were riffed on Mystery Science, I think they think of the AIP, giant bug movies at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'm wrong for thinking that, but that's the thing I think most people associate with the show.
Yeah, they could have always, of course, also ended with Final Justice, which would have it would have meant that, put a button on both Joel and Mike with,
Two Joe
Baker movies. So it would have been a nice bit of symmetry if they had gone that way. Even if Final Justice is, not like, it's not a monster movie, unless you consider Joe Don Baker a monster, of course.
I think in the Colossal episode guide, they consider him a monster. They write about, because they have a little column on each thing about, famous monsters of Mystery Science, and they talk about the Crawling Eye and Barugan and all of them. And then I think he's the one human exception. But in your book, you say that a lot of the stuff, is kind of fun and sort of lighthearted. But do you think they ever went too far, honestly?
They, as there is a lot. I don't say a lot, but a decent amount of jokes on people's appearances that do sort of lapse over into mean-spiritedness of, jokes of just basically calling people ugly or what have you, which is probably a bit too mean-spirited at times. And, so I do think at times that, they could be a little bit harsh or overly harsh in terms of commenting on the appearance of people. So yeah, I'd say, it wasn't like it was a common thing. And of course there's also, there'd be the occasional joke involving a foreign accent that was maybe wouldn't, fly in these modern times. But usually would feel at least slightly tongue-in-cheek. But yeah, I just remember off the top of my head, I think it maybe is in The Girl in Gold Boots, or maybe not, but just some guy, in the movies answering the phone, and Mike riffs, I'm still ugly, and it's that's maybe not very fair, and you'd get that occasionally. It wasn't a common thing, but that is probably a level of mean-spiritedness that is not something that I particularly have an affinity for.
I always go back to Joe Don Baker with that, because you brought it up with Joe Don Baker, but I always think that if anybody had kind of license to not like the show, I would argue that he probably had the most valid reason. Just because of how they treated him in Final Justice, Ed Mitchell, I think.
Yeah, I suppose, but he was also a known actor who had who has had a really successful career. He was in James Bond movies, and he was in Fletch, and he starred in the original Walking Tall. So he's got I'm not saying that because he's famously successful that he's a fair target, but he's maybe more of a fair target because he is a quasi prominent figure. But they were probably a little harsh on him at times, but he I could probably, because he was somebody people could recognize and probably did recognize, but yeah, it's he probably could have had that. And of course also when they did the thing with the fake Rick Sloan, and talking about him, which is sort of considered another moment like that. But of course Rick Sloan was able to parlay the Hobgoblin's appearance on Mystery Science 3000 into making a Hobgoblins 2. So, it's not like he hasn't, benefited from. Rick Sloan's actually benefited more than most of the filmmakers. Not that a lot of people went out to go see Hobgoblins 2 or that it made a lot of money, but, there would not be a Hobgoblins 2 if, Hobgoblins didn't appear on Mystery Science 3000. So he's, somebody who at least got a little something out of that.
It's interesting talking with some of the... I don't know if you've ever talked with anyone involved with any of the movies, but it's interesting talking with the directors, in that some of them absolutely loved the treatment and were unbelievably grateful and humbled by it, and some of them absolutely hate the show with a passion. It's just... Go ahead.
That's for example, who's somebody who, how about one of each? Who's somebody who was really into it and who's somebody who was really not into it?
Well, the guy who we interviewed David Worth, the director of Warrior of the Lost World, who absolutely loved the treatment of Mystery Science Theater 3000. One who did not love it and who was the obvious one for that would be Jeff Lieberman, the director of Squirm.
Mm.
There was an article in Scream magazine that was published, I think, maybe a year and a half ago, where they interviewed like 8 Mystery Science Theater directors. They interviewed the guy who directed Wild Rebels. They interviewed the director of Angel's Revenge. They interviewed the director of Girl in Gold Boots. They interviewed the director of Squirm. They interviewed the director of Hobgoblins. I think they interviewed the director of... they interviewed Ross Hagen. And it was interesting seeing the array of opinions, but Lieberman, I actually don't know how you pronounce his name, he's the one that was kind of... I don't know how to describe it, but I would say... He says, well, I don't care that they riffed it, and then he goes on for, 17 pages about how he doesn't care. And it's my experience in life that when someone says they don't care, and then they, rant about how it shouldn't have been on there, and they go on about how they don't care, that's a promising sign that they care.
Yeah.
I would think. But also, I've sent emails out to people, to some of the directors. I can't say their names, but some of them just don't want to be part of it at all.
Yeah, well, I can see that, but I don't know. I guess it really depends on the personality of the person, because there's obviously people who take themselves, very seriously, even when they're making, incompetent movies. And, being told that their movies are incompetent would maybe be, irksome to them, but, yeah. I can see, either way, and they're entitled to be irked by it, I suppose, just in the same way that Mystery Science Theater 3000 is entitled to, poke fun at the movies. It's, everybody's entitled to feel however they want about the movie, whether they created it or otherwise, I suppose.
That's true. But in closing, if we're going to end up here in a minute, but what advice would you have for someone who wanted to write a book like? Not obviously not about Mystery Science Theater 3000, but wanted to write a book in the same vein of that and have it published like you did?
Well, I would say if you really want to get something in terms of getting something published, and from a practical standpoint, you probably want to tackle something that you really well and have a passion for, but also that is not a saturated sort of market. For example, like I just mentioned, Simpsons, trying to get a book published on The Simpsons is very sort of difficult, because that's just such a huge market that a book can get lost in a market like that. So it's and obviously if it's not something that you are really into, it's probably not a good idea to write a book about it, because you have to spend a lot of time with the material. And because I've written articles for websites about things I'm not necessarily into, movie reviews, or just articles about whatever. One time for an article, I listened to every Hootie and the Blowfish album after a correct review. And so for an article, that's one thing, and you still have to handle dealing with stuff that's not necessarily super enjoyable. To extend it over a book would be and then just a matter of you gotta probably have a good take on it. Part of the reason I think this book got published was because I had, a clear way to sort of lay the book out. And also, the fact that McFarland, my publisher, is the book is an academic publisher, and the fact that it's partially a book on film criticism, and I happen to have my bachelor's degree in film studies, probably helped as well in terms of that, sense. So it's just find something you really are into, and something that is not very sort of commonly that you can carve out. If you can carve out a niche with an interesting idea on something that you're really into, you can probably find a home for a book if you put the work into both the book and also looking for a publisher, because that that can take a little time as well in and of itself, and you may get not you get rejected from some publishers, but because I've pitched other books and stuff even with the same publisher, and you get rejections and what have you, just part of the process. So it's just if you think you've got something good, and of course in this modern era you can always self-publish if you really want to, but if you really want to get a publisher, you usually have to put some work in, some effort in order to, unless you get lucky, which does happen, but otherwise just be prepared for it is a sort of journey from start to finish, however it goes.
What are your top 5 favorite Mystery Science Theater 3000 episodes?
Okay, top 5 episodes. 1 is probably Hobgoblins, because that movie is completely insane and so ridiculous and stupid, and the episode's really funny. Got a lot of really funny stuff in that episode, but also the movie's just fascinatingly bad. So I'll say that's number 1.
It's the movie that killed the phone sex industry.
That scene is just so weird, man. But it's that's part of what makes that movie wonderful and in its own way.
There's more of it, by the way. Before you go on, there's more that they didn't riff of the phone sex. So I highly recommend watching the phone sex scene. But go ahead.
2 is Pod People. That's got a lot of really sort of classic riffs, and is another sort of ridiculously bad movie. But you got a lot of great riffs, and obviously the whole Idiot Control Now song and everything like that. So that's probably 2. 3, I'm going to go with maybe a choice that's not as common, but Werewolf, which is an episode I think is a great episode with a lot of great sort of, riffs. And it's not as super bad as some others, but it is sort of, a bad movie that is, entertainingly bad. But then also I love the werewolf thing, from the host segment. So that one's 3. 4 is probably Space Mutiny is probably in the top 5. So I'll just say 4 is Space Mutiny. Again, a lot of classic riffs in that particular episode. That's that movie's bad, but that's obviously in terms of riffs and funny riffs and that sort of thing, that's got to be in there. And then 5's Wild World of Batwoman, which has a great short in cheating in that episode. That's one of my favorite shorts, the cheating short. And also that movie is completely insane in a wonderful way, and it's just fascinatingly bad. And so, yeah, I'll say that's my top 5 ends with a Wild World of Batwoman.
All good choices. I don't know if I would agree. Well, Wild World of Batwoman is the cheese that stands alone for me. But that short is really good. It's a great one you can argue whether the short was darker than the movie.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining on this kind of short notice interview. It was really fun to talk to you.
No problem. Glad to be here. Glad to talk about Mystery Science 3000. And I'm always up for talking about pop culture I enjoy. So happy to be.
If you ever want to be on in the future to discuss a specific topic or a specific episode, we'd love to have you.
All right, maybe I will take you up on that.
Well, thank you for listening. This has been the MSTieCast. I'm Josh MacLeod.
I'm Chris Morgan.
I wonder if there's beer on the sun.
Now, poopy.